Alright guys, welcome. We're picking up where we left off um, on freshwater resources. Now we're going to be talking about the oceans, and this will be all we have today. So remember, the oceans, we have 5 oceans. They are all connected. The Southern, the Arctic, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian. And really this makes one big single body of water that covers 71% of Earth's surface. Now, the ocean contains approximately, like I said, 96.5% of water by mass, with the rest consisting of ions from dissolved salts. The salts arise from runoff that carries salts and sediments from continents into the ocean. Sunlight does not penetrate ocean water very deeply, so temperatures will tend to decrease with depth, meaning the deeper you go down, the colder the water gets. Now, the physical makeup of the ocean is very complex, and so, why we said these bodies of water are all connected, this is kind of what makes them, separates them into separate bodies that we think of as oceans, right? Because there's these vast river-like flows of water called currents that are driven by differences in density of the water, differences in heating and cooling caused by the sun and latitude, and also gravity, and then a lot of it is wind as well. So you can see the Pacific Ocean over here. We see current coming down from California and then moving out into the ocean towards Hawaii. We see another current coming off Alaska, moving in towards Japan. We see this kind of big circular current here, and then we can see, as you get to the equator, this big crosswinds, right, moving over there. You can see the Atlantic Ocean here. We have the Gulf Stream current and the equatorial and Caribbean current moving everything around in the North Atlantic. The Arctic's over here all by itself. The Indian Ocean has its own current system kind of locking in around here. The Southern Atlantic has its own other kind of circulation down in this direction. And then the Southern Ocean has this current that goes all the way around, locking it off. That's why if you ever see those videos of people trying to get to Antarctica, it's quite the journey, given how insane those currents can kind of be. Because they have, as you can see, this kind of open lane of water here to just pick up speed. Surface winds and heating create vertical currents in seawater. A term you need to know is an upwelling. This is where you pull cold, deep, nutrient-rich water to the surface. Right? So this is water that's coming up from the ocean bottom. The ocean bottom is where a lot of sediments and nutrients will fall and deposit. So this is bringing up that cold water, bringing up those rich nutrients. And where upwellings occurs, where you tend to have very large stocks of fish, right? Like that's a very nutrient-rich area for phytoplankton, algae, and small marine life to flourish, and then subsequently larger marine life. So, where you get those upwellings of cold waters, where you tend to have very strong fisheries. Surface currents that converge create downwellings. This is where you transport warm surface water to deeper waters. So it's kind of the opposite, where the warmer waters are going on. This provides an influx of dissolved oxygen and a burying of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So again, these currents will bring oxygen from the surface down to deeper layers of the ocean. And also consequently, because carbon dioxide as a gas does dissolve into water, albeit just a little bit, that it helps bury and sequester CO2 and subsequently carbon deeper in the ocean. So many parts of the ocean floor are very rugged and complex, right? Underwater volcanoes build islands that come up above sea level. That's why if you look out, particularly in the Pacific, you'll see these chains of islands. These island chains are created by eruptions of volcanoes. Hawaii is a very good example of this. You also have very much the same features that you have on land, right? Just a little bit more exaggerated in some places. Stuff like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is an underwater mountain range that runs the length of the Atlantic Ocean. This is where two plains are smashing, or two plates are smashing together and creating this boundary. Here's a stylized what's called a bathymetric profile. Bathymetric profile is think a CT scan for underwater. It shows any key geologic features of the submarine environment. Continental shelves sit below the shallow waters bordering the continents. These shelves drop off at the shelf slope break. So that's where basically the water gets super deep. The continental slope angles steeply downwards towards the deep ocean basin. So here's a fancy good word for you. The thermohaline circulation is the worldwide current system in which warmer, lower salinity refers to the salt content of the water. So water that's lower concentration in salt moves along the surface And then colder, saltier water, which saltier water tends to be more dense, right, because it has more dissolved solids in it. Moves horizontally and below the surface. This moves warm water in the Gulf Stream to the Atlantic Ocean near Europe, where heat is released, and then cooler water sinks. The region of downwelling near Western Europe is called the North Atlantic Deep Water. The scientists are concerned that an influx of fresh water from melting glaciers in Greenland could disrupt this flow. Right, so as you can see, here's the thermohaline circulation. You can see the water, the surface current here is red. It's coming across and warm, and changing and dropping, getting cold, colder, and then it warms up as it's moving up north, and it's circulating, constantly going around and around and around, right? Sunlight's warming the water on the ocean surface in the tropics, and then as it hits into the Atlantic, to the North Atlantic, it sinks. So losing this current, if I remember correctly, is, I think that's the plot of the movie The Day After Tomorrow. Wow, it's one of these disaster movies that came out in the early 2000s. And the idea was that because we lost the Gulf Stream current for some reason, I forget what the mechanism is in the movie, that what happens is that the northern hemisphere, because it doesn't have this influx of water, because if you think about it, like, what happens is that it gets plunged into like an ice age, right, and just massive snows and like Arctic hurricanes or something that they create in the movie like happen really quickly, and the entire northern part of the continent freezes up. And this is built off of, I guess, like some grain of truth, right? Like, if you think about it, if you look at how far north Britain is, like the UK, right? Like, it's on the same latitude as, parts of southern Australia, or southern Alaska, parts of Siberia. And the reason that, it has such a temperate climate is that it is getting this influx of warmer weather, right? And that's why, some of the coastal regions around eastern Canada and the eastern U.S. stay pretty temperate compared to areas farther inland. If you're inland and you're away from oceans, you have what's typically called a continental climate. Continental climates tend to be very warm summers and very cold winters, right? Because it's actually the land surface that is predominating the climate system there. That's what you think about temperate climates like North Dakota, South Dakota, some of these big flat plain states tend to be pretty warm in the summer because you're getting a land surface keeping the heat, and then you don't in the winter you don't have water to help keep things warmer, so it tends to be much colder. Water has this in the atmosphere has this kind of climate moderating effect. You can think about this like if you during the summer when it's a really humid day, it'll be warm and still sticky at night. But then occasionally you'll have these nice nights where a high pressure front moves in and the humidity drops. And you typically see this on like nights when it's like totally clear stars outside sky and you can see all the stars. Those nights tend to be a little bit cooler because with less humidity, the air doesn't have as much capacity to hold heat, keep warm. So it's like you've removed the blanket. Ocean currents, other ones that you may have heard of is the El Nino, or what's called the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. This is a systematic shift in atmospheric pressure, sea surface temperature, and ocean circulation in the tropical Pacific Ocean. Now, under normal conditions, prevailing winds will blow from the east and to the west along the equator. This will form a large convective loop in the atmosphere. This causes a pile-up of warm water to form near Indonesia. This fuels massive storms in this region. So as you can see here, kind of the process here. Here's the convective loop vertically of water, air warming and moving up and cooling and moving around this way. And then you have ocean currents here moving this direction. And you see this pile up of warm water here indicated by the red over towards Indonesia. This occurs, or this event usually occurs in the late, like early winter, late fall. So the name El Nino, this comes from the Spanish for the Christ child, right? So it's named actually after Christmas and after Jesus. The idea of El Nino, the child, like the coming in December. So that's kind of where this name comes from. Now, regions of ocean water differ greatly within certain zones, supporting more life than others depending on characteristics such as topography. So that's, elevation, landscape position, temperature, salinity, that's salt concentration, nutrients, the concentration of precursor elements that things need for life of nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. And then the amount of exposed sunlight, or amount of sunlight. Sunlight changes, of course, by latitude. If you're in the equator, you get an equal 12 hours of sunlight every day, and nothing's ever different. If you are in the far part of the Arctic Ocean, there are periods of the year where you get 24 hours of sunlight, and periods where you don't see sunlight for a couple months. So it changes latitude, basically on the tilt of the Earth. Now, intertidal ecosystems spread between the uppermost reach of the high tide and lowest limit of the low tide. The rocky intertidal zone stretches along rocky shorelines between the lowest and highest reaches of the tides. So as you can see here, these kind of tidal zones here, where high tide comes into, low tide, exactly. So this is more of a, this is a rocky intertidal zone along rocky shorelines. This would be something like you would see on northern parts of the Atlantic Ocean, so on Maine, maybe parts of New Hampshire, and then you would see this fairly commonly in the West Coast. Right? There's a lot of rocky shores the farther north you go. Tides are the periodic rising and falling of the ocean's height at a given location due to the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. Right? So the moon is very close to us relatively, and as it moves around, it kind of pulls the ocean. And intertidal organisms are exposed to sun part of the day, covered in water the rest of the day. So it's a very extremely changing environment if you think about it, to be like baking in the sun for part of the time and then like soaked in water that's beating you to death the rest of the time. Rocky intertidal zones tend to be very highly diverse because environmental conditions such as temperature, salinity, and moisture will change dramatically from high to low reaches. So these are very extreme environments actually, but in a way that creates this mosaic of different patterns. Now, estuaries are bodies of water where rivers flow into the ocean, mixing salt water with fresh water. Salinity fluctuates daily due to the tides and changes in river flow here. Estuaries tend to be sheltered from the heavy waves of the ocean, and they will provide habitat for many plants, which provide food for shellfish, birds, and fish, etc. A salt marsh occurs where tides wash over gently sloping sand or silty substrates. Water from rising and falling tides flows in and out of salt marshes through channels that are called tidal creeks. Tidal creeks tend to be very winding kind of areas, long banks of grass. Very similarly, these are wetlands that use the ocean, kind of similar to the wetlands that we talked about in freshwater systems. They're just structured a little bit differently, and you have the influence of salinity, the salt from the ocean and the water mixing, and you also have the influence of tides. So, salt marshes tend to provide high levels of biodiversity. They also tend to filter pollutants, and they're very good at stabilizing shorelines, right? They create that buffer of just physically slowing the water down and giving space and separation from the whims of the ocean. These tend to occur in temperate intertidal zones where substrates can be muddy instead of just sandy or rocky. Mangroves, these have been quite the research focus lately. These are trees that are very salt tolerant. They have roots that grow upward to gather oxygen and others to grow down to support the tree, like stilts. Fish, shellfish, snakes, and other organisms thrive among the roots in the water. These are incredibly complex, rich habitats. Many birds will actually also feed and nest in the tree foliage. Mangrove forests will typically line tropical and subtropical coastlines. These are very prominent off the coast of India, parts of Indonesia, parts of Southeast Asia, or other parts of Southeast Asia as well. You see these in Florida. There's huge mangroves in like West Africa, like Victoria, West Africa, like mangrove trees that you move farther inland. Like these will extend miles and miles and miles. Some of these ones inland reach like 60 meters and are like the tallest trees on the planet. Mangroves are just crazy habitat. They'll have roots that extend up, 2 meters out of the water. It's insane. Now, kelp forest, these tend to occur on temperate coasts. You see a lot of these actually off the coast of California. These would be large brown algae called kelp that grow from the floor of the continental shelves and reach toward the sunlight at the surface. These are super dense. They're basically underwater forests, and they provide a lot of food and shelter for many animals. I think the most endemic or most common you would see here would be like a sea otter. Like these really big sea otters swimming around eating abalone and shellfish and everything else. And these really huge, very cool, tend to be in very relatively cold water compared to some temperate regions. The Pacific Ocean on average, for a given latitude tends to be much colder than the Atlantic. You may also be familiar with coral reefs. These are masses of calcium carbonate composed of shells of tiny animals called corals. So the actual structure that you see was at one point a living animal, and there's living animals on that are constantly building that up from excreting the calcium carbonate that builds the exoskeleton of this place. Coral reefs are typically found in three areas. They are extensions of a shoreline. They may be barrier islands paralleling a shoreline, or they can be a ring around a submerged island called an atoll. Don't actually know why they are restricted to this area. That would be interesting to learn more about. But these are like gorgeous areas. Like this is like Finding Nemo type thing. Just very colorful, all types of rich wildlife, crazy, beautiful areas. The corals themselves are related to jellyfish, and they can capture passing food with their tentacles. So they're like filter feeders, right? They just kind of extend out, and they just take in what comes to them. They also form symbiotic relationships with algae called zooxanthellae? Zooxanthellae, that sounds right, which produce food through photosynthesis. Now, most corals are colonial, meaning they make colonies, and they can tend to take over things. The surface of a reef will contain millions and millions and millions of densely packed individuals, as you can see here, all packed all together, and you have all the fish around. And they host tremendous biodiversity because they provide shelter from waves. And also the complex physical structure of the system produces many, many habitats. We actually use corals as a proxy for very large, complex forests, too, because they do create kind of a similar thing. This idea of creating complexity in space creates more habitat. They're really fascinating systems, all kinds of different stuff moving on there. And the more complex the system becomes, the more complexity it can actually withstand, and actually just builds and builds and builds. Now, many coral reefs have fallen victim to what's called coral bleaching. This is a process that occurs when zooxanthellae lose color and die, and this deprives the coral of nutrition. When coral is stressed by increasing water temperatures and elevated pollution, this is when this happens. Bleaching is evident by these whitened regions of this coral. In the open ocean, most primary productivity occurs in the top layer called the photic zone. Photic from photon meaning light. So photic zone, if you can remember the photon thing, is the area that gets light. Within this, microscopic phytoplankton constitute the base of this food chain. So, photic zone is where you get light. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about different stratification of the lake systems in Monday's lecture. In the ocean, really only think about the photic zone, where you get light, the pelagic zone. These are habitats found between the ocean surface and the floor, and then benthic, occurring on the ocean floor. So benthos, bottom, pelagic, in between, photic, the top layer where you get light. The uppermost reaches of the ocean contain billions and billions of phytoplankton. These are these tiny photosynthetic little algae, protists, bacteria. These are that basis of that food chain. Everything starts in the bottom. Let's wrap this up on oceans, and then we'll call it a day here. And then we're going to finish up with how humans impact water systems on Friday. I think that'll be really cool. All right. So that's it for today. You guys enjoy, and take care. Actually, I think we're going to cover this one Friday. I think a good 20-minute little lecture is good for everybody on this day.